All right, hello, AP World History students. We got a doozy of a concept to uncork and unpack for you here today. This is a big idea in the period 1750 to 1900, and the idea is called nationalism. Now, you've probably heard of nationalism before, or at least you've heard the word before, and maybe you think you have a sense of what it means, and maybe you're right. But it's definitely one that has a lot more contours and complexity than a lot of us might recognize, and its role in history is really quite profound. So I'm excited to unpack some of this together. Our learning targets, I can analyze the social and political power of nationalism. This idea is a bit like splitting the atom and the incredible energy that it seems to let loose within societies. So we're going to start to imagine or think about that. I can evaluate revolutionary moments in the light of God's story. And I want you to ask yourself, students, as you're listening to this, does this feel like it points to us as image bearers of God and the way that God creates us? Or what about the way that God creates us does this seem to stir up? Or to what extent does this seem to sort of point to the brokenness of the fall? And finally, I can practice being a seeker of justice in examining world events. So let's jump in. We talk about how 1750 to 1900 that this is like revolutions and responses, and a lot of these revolutions have embraced the ideas of the Enlightenment, right? And so this notion of like a set of rational principles upon which we will build the foundations of our new society and get rid of the olds and the traditions and the superstitions and all that Enlightenment optimistic notion that we can point towards something better, progress and reform using reason. That's like the yin of a lot of these revolutions and the revolutions that are going to come, that are still to come. The yang, the other piece that fits in, is an idea that's quite different in certain ways and not really an Enlightenment idea, and that is an idea called nationalism. And nationalism sounds like it's ancient, but the sort of nationalism we're going to talk about here isn't exactly ancient. Nationalism as this idea isn't something that really appeals to the mind and the reason and logic. It's something that's appealing to our gut, right? This notion of feeling, this notion of identity, of who I am and who we are and what we must defend. Students, think about if I asked you to make a list of I am statements that matter most to you, right? I am a student. I'm an AP World History student, right? I'm a son, I'm a daughter, I'm a brother, I'm a friend, I'm a whatever you are. I'm an athlete. Think of the I am statements that would matter most to you. Nationalists of the 19th century said, you know what we've got to do? Or what if we could get our population to identify, to make an I am statement that matters to them where they identified as their nationality, right? Their nationhood and their identity with a nation is a key understanding of who they are and who we are together. And when I say a nationality, I don't mean like I live within the borders of the United States or Canada or something like that. I mean like your people, right? Your kin. A nationality, like it says, it's people united by blood, by their ethnicity, by their language, by their religion, by some cultural heritage, and almost in a way where you can say we were a nation even before we had a state. We were a nation even before we had a government or we wrote down some constitution. We were a people. We were a nation. And what if we could get people to identify, I don't know about first and foremost, but identify in a deep gut way with that? What would be ways that we could stoke that we could push that weird part in the lizard brain of people, right? Deep in the evolutionary part of us, there's some like instinct toward tribalism, some instinct toward like kind of group identity and like we lock in with each other and we block out the other people, the bad guys. And leaders in Europe around this time, starting around the French Revolution and all the chaos that sort of starts sparking out afterwards, recognize there's ways that we can get people to identify themselves as a nation, even if we're talking about tens of millions of people who don't actually have kinship networks or like people who aren't related to each other and couldn't possibly know each other, they can see each other as like brothers and sisters in a member nation. Not just people who we both happen to be ruled by the same king, but we share a national identity. How can we do that? Well, we'll design national flags and national symbols. So this Germania, painting here, this is done before there is a state of Germany, but it sort of has these sort of national symbols of German identity, right? Um, Symbols of national unity, like the bald eagle for Americans and this national flag, national anthems, songs that we sing together to identify together. Students, have you ever wondered why almost every national anthem sounds like about the same? It's because they all come from like the same few decade period, from like the 1790s to the 1830s, when all these countries were like, yeah, we should have a national anthem too, as our way of stoking nationalism in our population. And then, a great way to stoke nationalism in our population, great, is like we can say, the key thing about who we are, it's not just that we are this nation and this people and maybe this religion and blah, 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 but we're not those people, right? There's another group that we define ourselves as being at odds against. There's a group that we can other, right? The other, or the fear of the other, is a key way that we can sort of assert who we are. And once we are this, then students, we can tell everybody, it's not just, we don't have to think of the government just as like this thing that we create to protect our rights. Now it's like, now we owe our loyalty to the government. Now we owe our duty to the government. Now we should sort of enlist and serve, because the government is sort of what can sort of like bring strength to our nation. And so this notion of nationalism is really incredible. And when they figure out ways to kind of push that button in us, they hammer away like they're old people sitting at a slot machine at the casino or something like this, just hammering away at this nationalism button because it stokes such a profound reaction into the public. Now, nationalism is a funny thing. Is nationalism bad? Is it good? I'm going to sort of leave it up to you. This analogy I got from a political thinker named Jonah Goldberg. I like it quite a lot. And he talks about how nationalism is like salt, right? Or it's like any poison, it's just a matter of the dosage, So if there's no nationalism in your civic life, no nationalism, it's sort of like bland food. It's like food with no salt, no seasoning in it. If there's no nationalism, no sense of kind of like patriotism, if there's no stirring of the heart with the flag or national anthems, or a flyover over a football stadium, or watching the fireworks or the Olympic medal ceremony, I don't know. It's like the most bland meal ever. Your civic life is just so bland and dull and boring. It's great to have some stuff like that. It sort of pops. It's wonderful. And it's just like some seasoning. And no one's pretending it's rational. It is aiming at our gut, but we kind of like it. And it does bond us together and help us feel more united with other people. It's like adding salt to your food. It's quite nice in the right dosage. But then you can be like at a friend's house and they are serving you pork chops and you're watching them get the pork chops ready and they put some salt in the pork chops and you're like, great, cool, thank you. And then they keep putting more and more salt in the pork chops and you're kind of like, hold off a second. And then, at a certain point, it's like, you're kind of ruining the meal here. You're putting so much salt on the pork chops, I can't really taste the pork chops anymore. You're adding so much nationalism, it's starting to turn gross. It's starting to turn weird. And you add too much salt to your diet. You ingest too much salt in too quick a period, and you die. You can add so much nationalism to your civic life that your civic life will die. It will kill itself, or it will turn on other people. We'll look at some examples of other places in history where nationalism has run amok. It can happen. It's weird. So I love that analogy. It really helps us think about things in a complex way. It's like a season to taste question. And it's why you might like more displays of patriotism, sort of low-level nationalism than I do, or vice versa, and that's fine. It's a bit of a seasoning question. But it's also an acknowledgement that you go too far and it can really turn things toxic. Now, tied to nationalism is an idea that we've learned about before, the idea of a nation state. What if every national group had their own state, right? And what if the state was sort of reinforced and reunited by like this graphic says, by a shared culture, a shared history, shared religion, shared national identity, the sort of territory, our fatherland or motherland, depending on how the language works, and a language. And then imagine what a sort of a cohesive, almost like hard unit this will become, right? Like, and this will become one thing that works together as opposed to just one chunk of land that one monarch rules over because of this treaty or that treaty or something like that. There were societies, Germany's the best example, Italy to a lesser extent, where at this time there is no Germany, there's no Italy, there's all these smaller principalities, and they're like, man, that would be great if we could unite all these smaller little petty states into one nation state, right? With a real sense of identity and unity. You know, Jews had a love-hate relationship with nationalism. For Jewish minorities living in a place, like in one of these petty nations, in one of these petty states of Germany, these small principalities, as German nationalists are talking about, we should create our own nation state, united on religion and culture and language. Jews are kind of like, ha, 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 just sort of feeling like, I don't think we're going to fit into that super great. And at the same time, the love part is there is a Jewish nationalism called Zionism, which is like we Jews, they said, are a nationality without a nation at all, right? We're sort of scattered around all these places. And so what if the Jewish nation could actually get a state or a nation of itself, and we could make a Jewish nation state? And so the origins of the modern state of Israel are tied to this sort of like the rise of the idea of nationalism in the early 19th century. Now, not everyone's like, nationalism sounds great. There's some places that are like, nationalism, yikes, that's a problem for us. Um, you know, uh, I know like a multicultural empire like nationalism says, pardon, a multicultural empire like Austria or Austria-Hungary, as it's later called, says, if we start mashing the nationalism button, we might as well set ourselves on fire. Because Austria, over there in southern, south central, and southeast Europe, just has dozens and dozens of language group, ethnic groups, lots of different religious groups. And if they all kind of come online, if all these small groups gain a weird nationalist consciousness, they're going to turn on the state, right? They're going to turn on us. They're going to turn on the Habsburg monarchs that rule over this empire of Austria. It's going to be a disaster. Frankly, a lot of kings are like, how about you guys just define yourselves as you are the subjects of King Welly? That's how I would like you to define yourselves, as opposed to this nationalist identity. And so a lot of kings are sometimes uncomfortable with this, especially because kings tend to expand their borders through wars, through marriages, and lots of times there wasn't sort of, again, a coherent cultural or language-based, population that sat under it. It was just that those are the borders of what they could control. After the French Revolution is over, there's this conference called the Congress of Vienna, which is like basically all these like leaders across Europe who say, hey, nationalism, that's cool. How about though if we just sort of like forget some of these ideas of the French Revolution about, liberty, equality, fraternity, a lot of this nationalism stuff, and what if we just sort of tried to put kings back in power, like in France where they used to be in power, other places, and we just sort of tried to stop these ideas from bubbling over to the surface too much more. And so there are people, especially the old guard, the old monarchs, or rulers in multicultural empires where they were really uncomfortable or nervous about nationalism. In the middle of the 19th century, we're not going to go into this too deeply, but in the middle of the 19th century, there's like a new wave of revolutions that break out. And they break out because things weren't going well with the old guard. Industrialization is very disruptive, as we've learned about. It changes a lot of things. It tends to sort of like move and shift power, economic power around. There's some bad weather, bad harvests. Nationalism is sort of agitating the people and stirring up certain desires in the public. And so there's all these like revolutions that almost break out in the year 1848. And like I note, it's really complicated here, but it's fair to say they wanted big change. They want to either set up Enlightenment style governments rooted in individual freedoms, or they just want a stronger nation. The ideas of nationalism are stirring them. In some cases, they're talking about sort of socialist ideas, and we'll get to that stuff later. And so, like, there's a lot brewing here, and I want you to give a sense of Europe in this period of time following the French Revolution. Nationalism has been introduced, and the old guard is trying to keep a lid on things. And it's just Europe, in a sense, is like a pot that's kind of rattling and clattering. There's a lot of tensions below the surface. Finally, to finish up this lesson, finish off this idea, nationalism's triumph in Europe in the 19th century is probably in Germany, and it probably is with the creation of the modern state of Germany. And this happened in Italy too, but in Germany, frankly, it's just of a little bit more consequence. So Germany, the modern state, is forged by this leader, this nationalist leader named Otto von Bismarck, who through a series of alliances and then small wars that he starts, and especially with a threat of war and an eventual war with France that he uses to kind of rally Germans together, he manages to create this large state of Germany right there in the center of Europe with a ton of resources, that is like rapidly industrializing and becoming a very, very strong country very rapidly. So all these old principalities and states are kind of being forged together. And again, Otto von Bismarck did that using the threat and then the eventual reality of a war with France to cause everyone to sort of rally together and create this one single state that was ruled by an emperor. And here we see the formation of this modern state of Germany and the crowning of a new German emperor. And here's Otto von Bismarck, the man who sort of made it all happen. And and it's interesting. You'll note this is actually in the Palace of Versailles, the symbol of French power. And they have defeated France in war. And they're saying, "How do you like it now, France? You got a new neighbor, and that new neighbor is Germany." And as you know, a lot of European history is going to follow from that point. Students, the next thing you're going to do here on your own is work on an SAQ. And so that SAQ is about the topic of nationalism. I think it'll give you a good chance to dive in. Thank you for paying attention here. Good work, and I'll see you soon.